Liesl Olson with the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us for today's program called Trifles, a Feminist Drama, with Martha Carpentier, Jeffery Kennedy, Peter Garino, and members of the Shakespeare Project of Chicago. We're grateful to the Paul M. Angel Family Foundation for sponsoring this program. The Newberry Library supports and inspires research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. Since our founding in 1887, the Newberry has remained dedicated to deepening our collective understanding of ourselves and the world around us. We connect researchers and visitors with our collection in the Newberry's reading rooms, exhibition galleries, program spaces, classrooms, and online digital resources. The Newberry has recently reopened our doors to readers and visitors. You can visit our website to make an appointment to do research, or you can stop by the library without an appointment Tuesday through Saturday to visit our exhibition halls. Our Rosenberg bookshop is open Wednesday through Saturday. Visit our website to learn about our current exhibition and public program series called Viva la Libertad, about the age of revolutions across the Americas in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The exhibition will be open through July 24th. Today's program is one example of the Newberry Library's civic commitment to public education and intellectual engagement, bringing together communities of scholars, students, and the public to discuss ideas that matter in our world today is central to the Newberry's mission. During the program, you can enter questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll get to questions after the production of Trifles. So I want to introduce today's speakers, who hopefully will be joining us now live. Yes, Martha and Jeffery as well. Great. Martha Carpentier is the president and co-founder of the International Susan Glaspell Society and a professor in the Department of English at Seton Hall University. She's the author of The Major Novels of Susan Glaspell. She is co-editor of Disclosing Intertextualities, the stories, plays, and novels of Susan Glaspell. And she's the editor of Susan Glaspell, New Directions in Critical Inquiry. I don't know anybody who knows as much about Susan Glaspell as Martha, truly the expert. Martha is joining us from Florida. Peter Garino is artistic director of the Shakespeare Project of Chicago. Most recently, he co-directed and appeared in the film By Help of Devils that examined the nature of evil in 14 of Shakespeare's characters. His other directing credits include Dark Side by Tom Stoppard, a play that incorporated Pink Floyd's landmark album, The Dark Side of the Moon. He holds an MFA in acting from Illinois State University and a BA in theater arts from Hofstra University, New York. He's a member of Actors Equity Association and SAG-AFTRA. Peter joins us from Niles, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
And Jeffery Kennedy is an associate professor in the School of Humanities, Arts, and Cultural Studies at Arizona State University. He is also a music theater professional, working as a music director and pianist for Broadway performers, an award-winning composer, arranger, and producer, with many recordings in gospel and choral music. His new book is called Staging America, The Artistic Legacy of George Cram Cook and the Provincetown Players. Can't wait to read it. It will be published by the University of Alabama Press in 2022, and Jeffery joins us from Phoenix. Welcome, Jeffery. So before I hand things over first to Peter, I want to say that the Newberry is an especially good place to come and learn about the playwright Susan Glaspell, who was a native Midwesterner. She was also a journalist and a major novelist. The Newberry holds collections related to the Chicago Literary Renaissance, the Little Theater movement, and Midwestern modernism more broadly. So come and visit and learn more. Now, the way this evening's program is going to work is that Peter is going to first introduce his production of Trifles, which of course he's already produced, and we'll watch a film version of it. We'll all watch it together. And then after the production, Jeff and Martha will each give us a short live presentation that helps us to understand the background and context of this really extraordinary one-act play. And then we'll all join in together for a larger discussion during which we will very much welcome your questions, so we can take those in the Q&A section. I also want to mention that this production of Trifles will be available on the Newberry's YouTube page until May 20th. So if you want to watch it again after this program, you definitely can until May 20th. It's kind of remarkable. Our discussion will be available too, and there'll be no date restriction on that. You can tap into our discussion anytime, in perpetuity, as they say on the Newberry's YouTube site. So, all right, Peter, I will hand things over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Liesl. Good evening, everyone. Thanks to the Paul M. Angel Family Foundation for sponsoring tonight's production along with the Newberry Library. Shakespeare Project of Chicago is delighted to present our theatrical reading of Susan Glaspell's Trifles. Let's talk a little bit about how we're going to do this. In a moment, you are going to see a link in the chat window where you'll click on the link and you'll stream the film directly from YouTube. Once you go to YouTube, you see on the screen right now, you want to make sure you click in the lower right-hand corner to go full screen, and also turn up your YouTube volume, the lower left-hand corner, so you'll be able to hear the play as well. So that's it. It runs 32 minutes, and after the film is over, we'll all be back here to discuss. So Karin will go ahead now and share the link, and we'll see you in about 32 minutes.
That was an incredible performance, and I'm excited to hear about the context of that play and to hear a little bit more about Susan Glaspell, and to then also have a discussion about this performance more broadly. We have to talk about that wallpaper. Wow. And the creative use of the constraint of Zoom to put on that performance. So let me hand things over now to Jeffery Kennedy, who's going to tell us a bit more about the larger context for Susan Glaspell writing Trifles and Susan Glaspell more broadly. So Jeffery will speak a bit. He's got some incredible slides to show us as well. And then Martha will speak as well. And then we will have a larger discussion. So Jeffery, we turn things over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it so much. Yeah, what an amazing performance. Well, I'm going to have our dear friend Elizabeth, who's there, to move these photos along. But I wanted to give you some context about Susan Glaspell and the Provincetown Players, which is where she and for whom she wrote the play Trifles. So let's begin there. Go ahead, Elizabeth, and I'll just say, go to the next slide from this point on. First, let me just read what historians, theater historians, and others have said about the legacy of the Provincetown Players. Mary C. Henderson said the Provincetown Players left a legacy unparalleled in the history of American theater. Robert M. Grundon, who was a historian of the Greenwich Village era, the summer of 1916, when the Players solidified their existence, may well have been the most important few weeks in the history of American theater, and certainly remains exceptional in the much broader perspective of American modernism. Todd London from New Dramatists, which is a contemporary theater group. The Players were the birth of an experimental art theater upon whose foundation so many of our later companies would stand. Historian and literary critic Christopher Bigsby said on November 3rd, 1916, Bounties for Cardiff opened not only the first New York season of the Provincetown Players, but also the history of 20th century American drama. And William Archer, who was both a British and an American theater critic, it is in the hallowed ground in the region of Washington Square or Greenwich Village, or among the sand dunes of Cape Cod, we must look for the real birthplace of American drama. Go ahead and change that slide. Susan Glaspell was born in 1876 in Davenport, Iowa. Her family, some of the early pioneers to settle in Davenport. She attended a teacher's college there for 2 years while working as a society reporter on a local newspaper. And then she went to Drake University in Des Moines, where she excelled in writing and won oration awards for speeches that she gave. After college, she became a reporter in Des Moines, covering the state legislature, writing feature stories, and eventually covering crimes and murders. She started writing full-time after this, publishing short stories, and in 1907, she released her first novel, The Glory of the Conquered, which was a critical and popular success. Her next novel, The Visioning, was released in 1911 and received similar acclaim. You can change the slide. She met the talented writer and teacher George Cram Cook in Davenport, but he married twice before they really began to know each other. After a year at Harvard, he for a time taught at the University of Iowa, creating their first creative writing course conducted in a workshop style. And actually, the famed Iowa Writers Institute there still credits Cook as the origins of their style of teaching writing. However, Cook really hated the short-sightedness of those working in academia, and he left it and became a published author. In 1912, he divorced his second wife, with whom he had 2 children, and moved to Chicago for the waiting period necessary to marry Glaspell. In April of 1913, they married and moved to New York City, honeymooning and spending their summer in Provincetown, Massachusetts, the end of Cape Cod, where they first had visited the summer before. Next slide, please. Cook had been the associate editor of the Chicago Literary Review, and while there, he had seen a performance of the Irish Players from the Abbey Theater that changed his life. He saw in this company their Irishness, if you will, in the style of language, story, characters, and even setting. And he longed to see something that likewise began to reflect America in its characters and identity on stage. Glaspell later wrote that without Cook seeing the Irish Players, there would likely have been no Provincetown Players. You can change the slide. In Provincetown, each summer gathered a group I've come to call the Regulars, led by writer Mary Heaton Vorse, there on the left, who first discovered the Portuguese fishing village of Provincetown in 1906 and convinced her closest friends, all writers, to visit there in the summers. This core group included Hutchins Hapgood and Neath Boyce, Wilbur Daniel Steele and his wife Margaret, and eventually Cook and Glaspell. And it was from amongst this group, considered the most radical and accomplished writers of their time, that the Provincetown Players were born. I changed the slide. Vorse purchased a wharf in 1915, mainly for the house that you see there on the left that's attached, that had been a chandlery or a store with boating and fishing supplies. But after Cook and Boyce and Glaspell staged performance for friends of a couple of their new plays in Boyce and Hapgood's home that July, Cook prevailed upon Vorse to let them use the fish house on her wharf as a makeshift theater to restage these plays for their friends. 2 more plays were written that summer and performed, and without really knowing it, the Provincetown Players were born. Change the slide. In 1916, Provincetown was flooded with artists, particularly as so many had returned from Europe because of World War I, and many had been invited by Cook to participate in another summer of theater. They spent the first part of the summer fixing up the wharf fish house, but before a performance took place, one of the 3 structures on the wharf caught fire, as you see there up in the upper left, though thankfully the fish house was saved. That summer, a young unperformed playwright named Eugene O'Neill had come to Provincetown, invited by writer and journalist John Reed, looking to have his work produced. Though the group rejected a few of his first plays he showed them, when Bound East for Cardiff was read, they knew that in O'Neill they had found a playwright who could write what they were looking for, something alive in the modern style with real talk and not leaded down with melodrama. So you see down there, the painter Charles Demuth, O'Neill, you see Reed and O'Neill, and then that's a scene from Bound East for Cardiff, O'Neill there on the far right, one of his few speaking parts ever. Change the slide if you would. This is a slide of The Game, a play by Louise Bryan, a metaphoric play. And that was also on the wharf. I wanted you to just see what they did on this wharf playhouse. The next slide, please. This is Thirst, a lesser O'Neill play, but none yet less unique because it takes place in a raft after a shipwreck. And so you see Louise Bryant to the left there, George Cram Cook, and O'Neill again in one of his plays. Change the slide, please. This is Enemies by Hutchins Hapgood and Neath Boyce, a unique play because it was autobiographical about their difficulties of being in a modern relationship. And you can see there, the door is open. You can see the ocean in the back. That was one of the features of the fish house. You can change the slide. That summer of 1916, Cook, as the clear leader of the company, announced that his wife would be writing a play they would produce, but he neglected to let Glaspell know, probably purposefully hoping she'd capitulate. Well, when she argued that she didn't know how to write a play, he told her that there was a stage across the street, in other words, the wharf, and she should go there and let the play come alive to her. Well, she did so, using a story of a murder she covered as a reporter as the basis for a new feminist drama called Trifles, which premiered on August 8th, 1916 in the Wharf Playhouse. This play would eventually become one of the more revered one-acts in American theater and is still today the most anthologized. Change the slide, please. This is the photo from the first New York production of the play of Trifles by the Washington Square Players that took place a year later. Change the slide. The Players moved their company to New York City, renting a parlor apartment at 139 McDougal Street in the heart of Greenwich Village. Change the slide. This is another production of The Game, now in their new theater in New York City. Change the slide. Here is one of the few photos taken in their first playhouse, and you'll see how really small it is and how very, very tiny the stage is as well. Those slatted seats were said to be the most uncomfortable ever in the entire world. Change the slide. Here's the Semaphore, their most unofficial, but nonetheless true home. That first year for social, you can go ahead to change. First year for socializing after performances. Cook believed that he could achieve kind of a beloved community. You can hold it there. While the Players would produce 93 plays by 47 playwrights by the spring of 1922, when they ended, Glaspell and O'Neill's plays predominated their repertoire. This is a photo from Glaspell's Women's Honor. Change the slide. In the fall of 1918, they moved 3 doors down to 133 McDougal, converting a former stable and wine bottling works into a theater where the Provincetown Playhouse still remains in Greenwich Village. Change the slide. Here's a photo from Glaspell's plays Bernice, her first full-length play. That is Ida Rao and Glaspell on the right playing the maid in the play. Next slide. Her play The Verge, which was completely radical in its expressionism, and a very unique second act, and this is a scene from that. Change the slide. O'Neill's The Emperor Jones took place in here, famously, and went on to Broadway and to tour the world, making the Players worldwide and famous. And change the slide. And his last play for the official Players, because they ended after it, was The Hairy Ape. Both of those last two highly expressionistic plays. Change the slide. Though in her time, excuse me, she was considered with O'Neill one of America's great new playwrights. Her legacy diminished somewhat after the Players ended, though she won a Pulitzer Prize in 1931 for her play Allison's House. Her work was rediscovered, however, in the 1970s by Feminist, and in its renaissance continuing till now, she has regained her rightful prestige. Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce Martha Carpentier, depending on the day. You say Carpentier sometimes as well. And she's going to talk very specifically about the history of the play Trifles. Martha.
Thank you, Jeff. Hello. As my colleague has indicated, Susan Glaspell wrote, published, and/or staged 14 plays, 9 novels, some of them bestsellers, and over 50 short stories. The question arises, why this one-act play Trifles has become the most reprinted, most anthologized, and most performed of all her works. There are many facets to the answer to that question, but what I want to address now is, what's so great about this play? In answer, 3 things. Its rhetoric, its representation of the status of women in the law, and its questioning of the moral and legal attitudes about crime and punishment in American law. First, its rhetoric, and by that I mean Glaspell's persuasive oratory, as it is expressed in the structure and language of the play. Brief anecdote. In 2015, the Eugene O'Neill Society and Susan Glaspell Society celebrated the 100-year anniversary of the Provincetown Players in Provincetown. At that event, the playwright Tony Kushner spoke about how much Glaspell's Trifles had influenced him, because as he said, it is so perfectly constructed. But what did he mean by that? Well, In all my years of viewing this play and teaching this play, I have never yet met a viewer or reader who, at the end of the play, wants Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters to give the bird to the attorney as evidence. In other words, all audiences and readers by the end of this play want these two women to break the law, to conceal evidence, and to protect a woman who is very likely a murderer. Do you see how radical that is? I don't have time to speak in detail about how Glaspell's powerful rhetoric accomplishes this, but I do want to just make two general points. The first thing Glaspell does is show us a gendered society in which men and women speak different languages, i.e., women are silenced because their realm of experience is considered to be insignificant trifles. Therefore, only other women who speak the same language can truly understand the causes of a woman's crime. And this is a language which, because it is silenced, is often composed of nonverbal signs, such as fruit preserves and quilting patches. The second thing Glaspell does is give us two women, one of whom, Mrs. Hale, is already convinced, based on her own empathy and sense of guilt or social responsibility for others, that Minnie Wright's crime should be forgiven. But the second of whom, Mrs. Peters, is married to the law. It is she who needs to be convinced, and it is she with whom the audience identifies. Therefore, as she becomes slowly convinced, both by Mrs. Hale's rhetoric and as she reveals her own life experiences, so does the audience. Moving on to my second point, Glaspell's representation of women's lack of status in the law. In this play, we see that woman is not a full citizen. She is a possession. In fact, she is herself a trifle. How did Glaspell learn that? Well, Glaspell claimed her play was based on an actual murder case. Quote, "When I was a newspaper reporter out in Iowa, I was sent downstate to do a murder trial, and I never forgot going into the kitchen of a woman locked up in town," end quote. In the process of her research for her biography of Glaspell, Linda Benz V first discovered the historical source, the murder of a 60-year-old farmer named John Hossack on December 2, 1900 in Indianola, Iowa. Glaspell covered the case and the subsequent trial when she was a reporter for the Des Moines Daily News, a position she began full-time the day after she graduated from Drake University in June 1899. Then she was a 24-year-old woman with a bachelor's degree in philosophy and several years of newspaper work behind her. These are the facts of the case. Sometime after midnight on December 2, 1900, John Hossack, a well-to-do farmer, was struck twice on the head with an axe while he slept in bed. And yes, you can think about the rhetorical and metaphorical reasons why Glaspell changed the murder weapon to a rope, but I don't have time to do that now. Margaret Hossack, his wife of 33 years, who was sleeping beside him, reported that a strange sound, like two pieces of wood striking, woke her up. She jumped out of bed, left the room, and heard the door to the front porch closing. Then, hearing her husband's groans, she gathered 5 of her 9 children who still resided in the home and re-entered the bedroom to find John Hossack bleeding profusely and dying. It was assumed at first that prowlers must have committed the crime, but when the axe smeared with blood was found under a corn crib and neighbors hinting at a history of marital troubles were interviewed, the sheriff arrested Mrs. Hossack. Glaspell filed a total of 26 stories on the Hossack case over the next 18 months, following it through the trial. I can't go into detail about these, but just to give you 2 titles that indicate Glaspell's own changing attitudes toward the murder and toward Margaret Hossack that she replicates in the play. Her first long article was titled, "Coroner's Jury Returns Its Verdict This Morning, Mrs. Hossack Thought to Be Crazy." Much later, after Mrs. Hossack had been released on bail and Glaspell had visited her in her home, the title of her article was, "Mrs. Hossack May Yet Be Proven Innocent. Tide of Sentiment Turns Slightly in Her Favor." The trial focused mainly on circumstantial evidence, as does Glaspell's play, until the concluding arguments. The defense tried to shift suspicion onto the neighbor whose wife had provided most of the damning evidence about dissension in the Hossack home. However, in its concluding statement, the prosecution dropped the bombshell that Margaret Hossack had been pregnant and given birth to a child before their marriage 33 years ago. This, the prosecution claimed, was the reason for the unhappiness in the Hossack home, which included evidence from neighbors of physical abuse, of John Hossack's repeated beatings of his wife and children over years. In less than 24 hours, the jury returned the verdict of guilty as charged, and Margaret Hossack was sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor. This was Glaspell's last story as a reporter for the Des Moines Daily News. Immediately after the trial, she resigned and returned home to Davenport to devote herself to writing fiction. Ultimately, Margaret Hossack's case was retried in 1903, resulting in a split jury, so that Mrs. Hossack, then near 60 and in failing health, was released and allowed to return home, her guilt or innocence still unproven. What is so striking to us today, of course, is that the original verdict on Margaret Hossack was based entirely on gender. That is, her perceived lack of appropriate behavior as a woman, confirmed by an out-of-wedlock pregnancy. Note that the defense never introduced the evidence of John Hossack's abuse, which today would have been a key argument, but which then merely represented Hossack's legal right over his wife and children. In fact, Margaret's pleas for help to neighbors would have been perceived negatively as disobedience and troublemaking. And another fact, throughout the trial, John Hossack was described as a pillar of society. Moving very briefly to my last point, Trifles' questioning of moral and legal attitudes about crime and punishment in American law. When Mrs. Peters says, "The law has got to punish the crime," and Mrs. Hale responds, "Oh, I wish I'd come over here once in a while. That was a crime. Who's going to punish that?" They represent two opposing views of law and of crime. The first is an absolute reading of law and of crime as the result of individual moral culpability. The second is a conditional reading of law that considers the moral responsibility of community in the culpability of individuals who commit crimes. The first must call for unmediated punishment. The second may consider rehabilitation in lieu of punishment. These two approaches to crime and punishment are still debated today. And that is the reason Trifles is often taught in law school courses across the country. Thank you very much.
Martha, thank you. And Jeffrey too, and Peter, join us as well. So much to say, discuss, talk about. Wow. Does seem like one of these incredible moments when art tells the truth of things. I mean, that historical context of the crime story, I mean, that just gives me another set of chills, thinking about also her writing so many pieces about that particular case in Des Moines, or for the Des Moines, what is what newspaper that she was writing for? The Des Moines, oh, you're on mute, so unmute yourself, no worries.
Des Moines Daily News.
Des Moines Daily News, wow. Peter, let's return to your production of this play for a minute, and then we can go big too. But I just feel like we need to pay some tribute to your extraordinary actors. And maybe you can tell us what it was like to shoot this play during a global pandemic, when Zoom is your medium. Tell us about your cast and how you did this.
Yeah, so I just want to give a shout out to Deb and Judy, Kish, Matthew, and Henry, which were the cast members. Yeah, so we worked on this play really intensively during the time of a week. We had a total of 8 hours actually, and that included rehearsal, table talk, and 3 nights of intensive, filming. And we approached it like a film. So as you could see, there in most scenes there was maybe a master shot with 2 people, and then we would shoot individual close-ups, and then go back and edit it. Put it together in the editing room, and so it was a hybrid of sorts. It was a reading, right? So the actors were on book, although we tried to do the best we could as far as that. But one of the things I felt strong about was in the very beginning of trying to find a unifying way to set this play in space. And that was, there's a direction in the very beginning of the play where Susan Glaspell describes the interior in great detail of the Wright house. And she talks about this idea of faded wallpaper, So that kind of stuck with me. And I thought, maybe we can, because the thing about Zoom is you want to try to locate the people as much as you can in the same place, even though you have these separate little, windows. So I went out, did some research, got some wallpaper from Home Depot, and that was probably one of the most challenging parts of the whole production, was dividing that up and relying on a very unreliable postal service to deliver it to 5 separate locations. In fact, we were actually delayed filming because it was not delivered on time.
Well, it was worth it. I mean, it really works. And,
Yeah.
Parts of it you can see are appealing, and it's the flowers. You had a strong aesthetic sense and rightness about what you chose there. Yeah, it's really great. And in some ways, the Zoom boxes, I mean, of course, you want to see the actors' bodies and you want to see them move around space, even if it's a super tiny space, as Jeff points out in those photos of the original stage. But on the other hand, the squaring off of people, the divisions among them, and especially the ways in which you took the women, they were together, and the men, they were together, but they weren't all together ever.
Right.
The gender distinction there was really, really well done.
Yeah, there was only one shot in the film where we had all 5 on the screen at the same time, and we were going for about 20 seconds.
Right.
And the way I constructed it was so the 3 men were on top and the women were on the bottom. That kind of worked aesthetically, with regards to that. But it was a great deal of we had a great time working on it, and Martha and Jeffrey were both very inspiring in some of the conversations we had early on about talking about the role of language and the role of silence. And that was really a real joy to work in the editing room and really begin to piece this together so that we could really present some of those silences of the women looking at each other, and as I call it, the dream ballet at the end, which was I think we were really struggling about how are we going to do that. But I think we did okay pulling it off.
You definitely did. So both Martha and Jeff discussed a bit about Glaspell's other modes of writing, both as a journalist and also as a novelist. There's the amazing story, myth or fact, that George Cram Cook, Glaspell's husband, said, write this play, and made her write it in some ways. I was hoping you might give us a little bit more context in terms of, Martha, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how her work as writing plays impacted, her work more broadly as a writer. I mean, Jeff pointed to the fact that the Irish players, were deeply, influential over the Provincetown players. We know too that W.B. Yeats comes to Chicago and profoundly, for a memorable banquet and celebration in his honor in 1914, hosted by Harriet Monroe, and really sends ripples throughout the literary community in Chicago. I'm curious, Martha, if you can tell us more about, again, the kind of mode of writing plays that was coming out of all of this excitement among the Provincetown players and in Chicago too, and how that affected Glaspell's other writing.
Well, of course, Glaspell never planned to be a playwright. She identified as a novelist and fiction writer. But her novels and her short stories prior to this experience are very naturalistic in style. They're, of course, reminiscent of Dreiser. She's in the school of local color and realism with Sinclair Lewis and so on. What happens to her work through working as a playwright with the Provincetown players is that it improves 100%. It becomes much more deeply psychological. It is much more dramatic. Obviously, there's a lot more dialogue in it and a lot less exposition. And she even has later novels that are structured as plays. In fact, most of her later novels, some more overtly than others, are structured as 3-act plays. So there's no question that it radically improved her writing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when the players ended, and really that comes down to a split between George Cram Cook and Eugene O'Neill, Glaspell was at a crossroads. We know that O'Neill and she had a very, very collegial relationship, and he certainly encouraged her to send her plays to Broadway, the direction he was going in. But Glaspell really chose to accompany Cook, her husband, who, despite his many flaws, she adored, to Greece. They lived a very bizarre life, which makes for interesting reading there. But he died within a year. And when she came back, it was like she had missed the opportunity to follow O'Neill and catch that boat onto Broadway. But she went back to Provincetown and went back to largely identifying as a fiction writer, writing novels, until she was tapped years later to work for the WPA in Chicago.
Return to Chicago, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
right. Jeff, maybe you can tell us, there's a great question about the distinct sense of Midwesternness in this play. You know, she clearly spent time in the Midwest, a lot of time. She's a Midwesterner at heart. Yeah. Martha, I know you've talked a bit about her use of Midwestern speech, and here she is bringing that to an East Coast audience. How was that, Jeff? How was that received? That geographic distinction of her plays and her modes.
Well, interestingly, you know, which you know the most about of us, the Chicago Renaissance was so important in changing syntax and language to what sounded American, not kind of faux British. So much of what was going on prior to this, until Dreiser, until Sherwood Anderson, until Upton Sinclair and Sinclair Lewis, we're getting a kind of a faux British kind of style. And so she's very much in the pocket of modernism, which Cook sometimes is not remembered to have been an editor there at the Chicago Literary Review with Floyd Dell, who was telling the country, here's what modernism is. And so he was so significant in that piece of it as well. And you begin to see this, even though her earlier novels kind of have a romanticism to them, you're still seeing the language begin to change. So to be honest, it was radically heard. But in the same way that O'Neill's many dialects, because for his experience on ship and at sea, were all of these Swedish and German and all of these different sailors, and his plays are filled with these dialects. In a sense, Glaspell was another dialect.
Right. There's like an attention to the materiality of the medium, whether it's stripped down Midwestern, that's going to be radical, right, or whether it's a kind of fusion of different immigrant voices.
And also, you weren't seeing mid to lower class folks as main characters in plays,
right?
And so that was as much a part of the radicalism of this play and the others that the players were writing and performing.
Right.
Um,
I want to,
Liesl?
I have a question for Peter too, but somebody wants to know, I wonder if any of you can tell us, did she know Willa Cather? Were there any connections with Cather? Yes, Martha.
Martha knows
They
that.
didn't like each other at all.
Mm-mm.
In fact, they knew each other in Greenwich Village, but they did not like each other. But
Okay.
I have actually studied and written an article comparing their publication histories, because the question does arise: why are all of Willa Cather's novels still taught, still in print, and none of Susan Glaspell's? Because their careers are very parallel and comparable.
Mhm.
And that's a longer answer and a very interesting
No,
one
that's
that
fascinating.
we
That's
may not
fascinating.
have time for me to go into.
Right, right.
But Cather was very much a self-promoter, and Glaspell was incredibly modest and shy. And also, they're two different publishers. I mean,
Well, and the
Cather
irony,
published with Knopf, and he supported her work for 80 years. Glaspell published with Frederick Stokes. They went out of business. They were bought by Lippincott, and in 1942, they sold the metal plates of her novels to the war effort to be melted for.
I see.
the weird
So that
irony
was the end of her novels.
the weird irony was Cather's editor is actually whose home they bought, rented the first 2 summers in
Okay, so they
Providence.
knew each other very well. Yes,
Well, they
yes.
knew each other
They
in
knew each
passing.
other, but it just there
Yeah.
were these ironies of
I
things.
see.
They're
I
oil
see.
and water.
Right, I see.
Part of it is Glaspell's progressive politics, which
Right.
not at all describes Cather, who
She
was
was a real
actually
radical.
quite
Absolutely. There's so
conservative.
much praise coming into the Q&A for the production. And Peter, somebody has a question for you in relationship to your work with Shakespeare and Shakespeare's language. We're talking about the Midwestern speech of Glaspell's play, but this person is asking, will you talk about the ways in which you see Trifles as Shakespearean in its use of language and themes? Bravo to you for your beautiful presentation. So much care and detail has gone into this.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's Shakespearean because the most brilliant people in the play are women. And that's common in lots of Shakespeare's plays, that the real true minds are women. There's also something really interesting with language, with the way that Glaspell creates this, I would say, a contrast between relationships. We have that long speech by Mr. Hale in the beginning, right? And we know that's Mrs. Hale is his wife and they have children. But we also learn from that speech from Mr. Hale that he likes to talk, So that's a marriage where there definitely is communication, right? So she sets that up beautifully, right? To see Mrs. Hale and Mr. Hale, and they have kids, and there's communication going on. And the very first thing that he comes over to talk about is, let's see if we can get in on a telephone line, right? Let's see if we can communicate and not be so isolated out here, on the prairie. So that was another big thing culturally that was happening at the turn of the 20th century, was the advent of the telephone too.
Right, right. There's a comment from Nancy about the wallpaper reference, reminding her of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Yellow Wallpaper, as well as the whole play having resonances with Kate Chopin. So in terms of Gilman, Chopin, what are the connections there, if any? Any one of you can take that.
They're all turn of the century feminist women writers.
Right.
So there's
right.
going to be similarity of themes.
Right. Are there another viewer is choosing a particular line in the play that resonated with her, or yes, and it is most of my life has been lived in stillness. And I have a favorite line from the play too, which is nothing here but kitchen things. I'm wondering, you three of you have worked really closely with this play. Are there lines or moments that really resonate? Are your favorite moments or lines?
Well, I have to say, for me, it's that she dared the silences.
Yeah.
For me, it's actually not in the line. It's that she dared let things speak, and the three of us have talked about, four of us actually talked about, that this is a pre-Stanislavski training for acting. The idea of what you do with a silence on stage was something unheard of. And the complete opposite was O'Neill at the time. O'Neill was so verbose and about repeating and rhythm, and actually it was very much a part. Some people try to edit him and then they don't understand why the play doesn't work. It was very, very important for him. And they were two sides of a coin. And so for me, it's that, and she does this throughout her plays. Here is the main character of the play absent from the beginning. And so the silences that speak volumes between the women for me is what
allowing that to happen, allowing silence to be its own language and to be its own form of communication. Yeah, it's super powerful. Peter, what about you working in production?
I think yeah, we think she was gonna nod it. I mean, that line is repeated 3 times.
Yeah.
And at the final one is she's, you know, they're saying to the men, you know, yeah, she's pretty good with a knot.
Right. It's extraordinary. I mean, they quilt, you know, they knit, they preserve fruit. Turns out they murder too, you know. I mean, they not the nodding. It's
I just think Glaspell is doing this with that last one, you know.
Right.
It's heaven.
Well, it does refer to a different style of quilting, actually.
Okay, Martha, tell us more.
You've seen those quilts where instead of the layers being sewn together, there's just one at each corner, there's just a tuft that's knotted. Have you seen quilts like that?
Yes, yeah, I know what you're talking about.
It's a clicky way of making a quilt. The layers are just knotted together instead of the laborious process of quilting them.
Right. Martha, what about you in terms of your favorite moments or lines in the play?
Well, as I said, I think Mrs. Hale's line about who's going to punish that? Why didn't I come? Why didn't I help? Why didn't I help? Who's going to punish that is really astounding.
Powerful.
And
right.
touching. Yeah.
So that kind of ways in which that line opens up questions about criminality, what constitutes crime.
How does community contribute to criminality? And I mean, look where we're at today. We still have not solved that problem at all.
Right.
You look at who's in our jails. Who was populating our jails?
We talked about this idea of isolation, and it's a perfect, you know, play for right now. I mean, people are coming out of 15 months of isolation, and are we going to be different? Are we going to behave differently, you know, as a society, as a culture, and how we interact with each other? So to that regard, I think it's really interesting.
And also, she was working against the criminality of the Espionage and Sedition Acts that had been, she goes into it much more in Inheritors, but she is the idea of criminality for just speaking out all of a sudden becomes something in America. And that had not been true before. And so, and the village was consumed with it because they were all radicals in the government's mind as world, and yet you weren't allowed to protest without risk of being arrested or writing even about it. The masses were shut down, you know, all of those kinds of things. So this is, you know, again, the silences of speaking or not about what was right or wrong. And there was a morality change going on in the country that no one knew how to really deal with yet.
Lisa, could I just follow up?
Please. Yeah.
Glaspell was an incredible chronicler of right and left in this country, of red and blue in this country. What we're suffering from today, and that's why so much of her work is relevant, she captures this central divide in how Americans think, largely based on region, in other stories and in other novels, and certainly in the play Inheritors, the conservative versus the liberal and progressive. And, you know, she wrote, there's a beautiful note she wrote, private note after Sherwood Anderson died, where she said how deeply she understood the loneliness he felt in the Northeast.
Right.
Yeah,
well,
just
like
never
Anderson,
at home.
Right. Like Anderson, who, you know, was rooted in the Midwest, in Ohio in particular, and then lived a lot of other places. Anderson wrote about poverty, and Glaspell's play, this play also seems to be about poverty, right? Lack of things, like in a big,
she has novels about orphans.
Yeah.
Orphan children. And
Right. But the ways in which not having,
Yes.
the
Well,
almost
I
the
think,
political problems with that, I mean, there's no phone, right? There's a shortage of people to help you work, to help you get things done. It opens with this description of the potatoes that needed to be delivered, right?
well,
Yeah,
she felt a lot of pride that her family had started as settlers in the Northeast and farmers, and then moved west. So there is a certain shared heritage of farming, agriculture, poverty, and so on.
right,
But it's the intellectuality, the pretentious intellectuality of the Northeast that she and these Midwestern writers really were battling.
right.
And yet, if you look at the history of the short story in this country and look at this whole generation, all the great American writers were from the Midwest.
You don't have to tell me that. I got that. No,
Yeah.
yes. No, I mean that it's powerful actually.
Yes,
What a
yes.
locus, the Midwest and particularly Chicago as the urban center there in the Midwest really
And they
was
take
for
and they
American
take
art.
that to the village with them too.
That's
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
That's the
Yes.
thing. It's so amazing that geographically it really did move. That was that powerful, you
Right.
know.
Right. There's a way in which they get to try things out in Chicago, be wildly experimental, kind of hone things, and then take it elsewhere. There's a question about the relationship between Trifles and the equally well-known story, A Jury of Her Peers. It sounds like the same plot in different literary modes. Is that
Yeah.
something you can
Correct.
talk a little bit more about? Correct
Well,
is the answer.
Go ahead, Martha.
Well, Glaspell wrote short stories to pay the bills. And she turned, which isn't to say her stories are insignificant as literature. They are quite significant and published in major journals. But very often the story and play versions are quite similar.
I see.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. So
Right.
these two are similar. Actually, the story, the title Jury of the Peers, it emphasizes her focus on law. How can a woman's crime be judged when women, her peers, cannot be on a jury? And by the way, women were not universally allowed on juries until 1971. Not just food for thought.
Another chill.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. But
There's
that
more-
story, Jury of Her Peers, was published in an insert, a circular insert in Sunday newspapers all over the country. It
Wow.
was read all over the country, contrary to the play, which was seen Chicago, New York.
Right.
You know?
Right. So there's she's working in different modes to reach different audiences too, right?
Right.
Yeah. There's more praise for this particular production, and kudos to Peter for in some ways allowing the two extraordinary actresses to use these moments to say so much. That must be hard in some ways as a director to allow that silence to stay, to fill, especially via Zoom.
Yeah, well, I just give Deb and Judy so much credit for that because they understand that the silence is as important as the dialogue, right? In some cases, it speaks more. So they just did a fantastic job with that.
Right, right. There was another question, and this may be our last question for all of you, depending on how much you have to say in response to it. If Glaspell and Eugene O'Neill are maybe the right now for us in our moment the best known playwrights of the Provincetown Players, I assume then too. What other plays would you recommend from that moment, from these two playwrights, maybe from Glaspell, just since the focus is really Glaspell? What else should we really be looking at for people who aren't as well versed in the theater of the early 20th century as you three are? Martha,
Well, for me, the
go
other,
ahead, Jeff.
Jeff,
Yes.
Jeff.
well, the other playwrights that first come to mind are Rita Wellman, who was the first Provincetown player to be on Broadway with a play even before O'Neill. So Rita Wellman, who wrote about women's issues a lot, and she did her work more in kind of sometimes in kind of almost farcical kinds of things. She wrote a play about the war called Barbarians, and that's pretty amazing. Edna St. Vincent Millay's Aria da Capo is a classic. It was called the best play in the English language that year. So it certainly is one. And her other plays weren't so much. Juna Barnes, even though her first play is considered unable to be understood by all the critics at the time, nonetheless established a style of playwriting that was pretty significant. So those are the first three that come to mind. I think the most important thing to hear, those are all women.
Yes.
And there were 16 women playwrights in the Provincetown Players. That's just unheard of.
It's amazing, right? Martha, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, of Glaspell's work, my favorite is Inheritors. I think it's an American classic. Yeah, it's so relevant to us today. It's unbelievable how relevant it is to us today. And I would just urge everyone to read that play.
Inheritors.
And see it performed if you can.
Absolutely, soon, right?
Yes.
So what about you?
I liked Suppressed Desires was another Glaspell play.
Suppressed Desires. Okay. Yes.
It's hilarious.
Okay, it's a
comedy. She can write comedy, and that play is
so
witty.
There's
Freud,
dark humor in Trifles too. I mean, the
yeah.
nodding is dark humor. You know, she's funny. Yeah.
Women's Honor is an ultimate farce, where a guy won't tell who he was with overnight because she was a married woman he was having an affair with, so he's going to take the rap for a murder and not reveal who she is. And then all these women show up to say it was me, even though none of them were that, so she knew how to do tongue-in-cheek big time.
Amazing. It's so wonderful she's never really been off the radar, but to some extent spent so much time recovering a genius.
Oh, she was off the radar.
American. You think, okay.
I know
you're the expert. Yes.
It's been a lot of hard work trying to bring her back where she belongs in the American canon.
Right.
For a lot of scholars.
Yeah.
Well, thank you to the three of you for helping do that work. Really, really amazing. So unfortunately, we're at time. So we'll
thank you.
Yes, say our goodbyes. Thank you to Martha, Jeff, and Peter, and our special thanks to the Paul M. Angel Family Foundation for sponsoring this program. And thanks to everybody for joining us today. So as I said earlier, a recording of this program will be available on the Newberry's YouTube channel in a few days. And the link to the actual production of Trifles will also be available until May 20th, I think. Newberry programs remain free and open to the public, thanks to the generosity of our donors. During this critical time, we need the support of our entire community. Please support the Newberry Library by making a gift today. You can do so online at newberry.org/give. We look forward to welcoming visitors back to events at the Newberry soon. In the meantime, please join us for our next virtual program, which is called Declaring Independence and will take place on Thursday, May 20th from 3 to 4 p.m. Central Time, when a group of Chicago high school students from the Instituto Justice and Leadership Academy explore what it means to declare independence. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you'll come back and join us for future public programs at the Newberry.